translation, you can understand what I'm saying. I have a lot of pictures, and I'm an urban planner and a social epidemiologist, so I believe that sometimes images are as powerful as our data. It's also a wonderful presentation we just heard of two projects that we're working on in collaboration at UC Berkeley, with the university, with local government, with decision makers, with civil society, NGOs, in cities both in the US, and I'll give you an example from our work in Africa, in Kenya specifically. And I'm going to argue or present to you that we need to put health equity at the center of what we do, as we just heard. And part of that means rethinking the research and action work that we have done as academics for so long in public health and in the other sciences. It means thinking about how we connect our research to policy much more explicitly. And I'll go through the introduction pieces quite quickly because I see people need cafe and to get some energy. The basic argument here, is this too loud? Is it okay? Está bien. We are on an urban planet. So if we think about global health, population health, we must take cities and urbanization seriously. So I would argue we need to move from thinking about country disparities and look into cities and within city inequalities. And I'll give you some examples of how we're doing that. So this is the world, large cities, 1995. And this is today. And the projection is we will be at 65 to almost 70% urbanized as a planet in the next 20 years. Of course, Latin America is already largely urbanized. So you are in a good position to think through both what have we done well and what can we do differently as this trend continues. And in my work, I argue that city urbanization for the planet is a good thing. It's a good thing for the inequalities we just heard about. It's a good thing maybe for economic inequality, maybe redefining what development means. But cities are driving local economies around the world, not just in rich countries, but also in emerging economies. And what we see in cities is this overlapping, multi-dimensional set of issues that both influence our health, but also the sustainability of our planet. And I'll give you some examples. So here's an example of some of our data from Kenya, Nairobi. So it's healthier to live in the city of Nairobi. Here, this is child mortality. But it depends on where you live in that city. So if you live in a slum or an informal settlement, you're almost more than twice as likely to die, child mortality rate. So it matters where you live in that city. And this is a stark example that we see around the world. Sorry, here in Latin America, in the US, in Africa, this is Sao Paulo. And this doesn't happen by accident. We as architects, planners, public health officials can influence these outcomes. And this is, again, not unique. This spatial difference that we saw in Scotland, that we saw in Europe, it's a global phenomenon. And there are data from almost every region and city in the world, and we see this spatial variation. So it's not enough to look at Paris, this is Paris, and health inequalities, mortality, along one of the metro lines in Paris. So we can't look only at countries, comparing country to country for inequality. We can't even look at city to city teams. We are aiming to do action research, which means we don't just want to analyze what are the problems, but how can we move from analysis to action? And how can we learn from some of these bad policy experiments? Can we collect data? Can we do evaluations in real time to say to decision makers, to people with power to change opportunities, that this is not healthy, this is not equitable. We don't design studies to track things over time, our longitudinal studies, which we do very rarely in epidemiology. We are not in a strong position to participate in these decisions. So I'll give you some quick examples from our work in California, the San Francisco Bay Area. This is Richmond again, San Francisco and Oakland, and also in Nairobi, Kenya. So Richmond, California, and we just recently had a year of guests from Medellín coming to Berkeley and Richmond to share experiences with violence reduction that you have accomplished here, so we can learn from you about maybe what might be successful in very violent, gun-violent communities in the United States. When we started our work in Richmond, it was the 8th most violent city in America. Almost 50 gun homicides per 100,000. That didn't compare to the 300 or more that you used to have here in Medellín, but I know now the rates are in the 20s or so here in Medellín. It's a city with a long history of industrialization, poverty. It's really the kind of working class area of the San Francisco Bay Area, with much of its industry and the home of many of its new immigrants who try to get their start economically and socially. And it had chronically the worst health outcomes by every measure. So again, we, after mapping and looking at the data, said, well, it wouldn't be enough to focus just on hypertension, or just on heart disease, or just on smoking, or exercise, or obesity, because we had all of those and more in this community. So again, typically in public health or epidemiology, we focus on one exposure, one outcome. We said that was going to be inadequate here, so what could we do differently? We started by saying, we don't know. But let's engage with residents who live in this community, who experience disease and environmental exposures and poverty. And we had a series of workshops and participatory sessions to ask people how would they define a healthy community, a healthy neighborhood? What are the characteristics? And then we could turn those, as epidemiologists, into indicators, qualitative and quantitative. It also gave us the opportunity to do community-led participatory research, where community members were surveying their own neighbors. They were gathering data in their own community, because they know their community better than anyone else. And we co-published reports on that, and that brought people together to think about these multiple determinants of health in their community. There was no one who said, I'm only experiencing diabetes today. I'm experiencing diabetes. I don't know where my next meal is going to come from. I am maybe evicted from my house. My children are being discriminated or punished in school unfairly. I'm inhaling polluted air. I have no public access to transportation. So again, what we heard from people were the comorbidities and the multiple exposures that they experienced. And so we went back to that model of the social determinants, and most of what we do, particularly in medicine, but less and less hopefully in public health, and I know not in this school of public health, is on this right-hand side, what we sometimes call the downstream part of public health. We just saw this model, and this is the behavioral change, the healthcare, and case management. So what did we do? We took 3 specific strategies. I'll go through this somewhat quickly. And this is the result of about 10 years of work. So it doesn't happen in 1 year or in 1 term with our students. So the first was to develop a health equity chapter or section of the city's general plan. By law, many cities around the world have to have a plan. As an urban planner, we know that most public health people have no clue. Most of the time, the plans sit on a shelf and nobody listens to them. What we wanted to do was make this really responsive to the community-based research we had been doing. And these were the kinds of things that were integrated into the community health and wellness element or chapter. And it had legal, it was by law, had to be addressed as part of California law. The second thing we did was to institutionalize health equity within city government. We created something called the Richmond Health Equity Partnership. And we brought institutions that don't call themselves public health together to work on public health. The school district, community-based organizations that worked on arts and culture or youth, immigration. These were all health issues, and we focused on data collection, new policy making called Health in All Policies, which I'll focus on now, and integrating a health equity strategy within every school, because the schools feed more young people and touch more people and their families on a daily basis than any other institution that we could identify in the city. So the third thing we did, and this again was a multi-year process, was adopt the first Health in All Policies law in the United States at the city level. Now, World Health Organization has been very much behind HIAP, Health in All Policies. And what this really means is to put a health equity analysis or framework into every city decision making. So when the city does its budget, how much are we going to spend on fixing roads or parks or the choices that a city has to make on an annual basis? We developed health indicators and a process of health impact assessment to analyze those decisions and to inform them with a health equity lens, including hiring city staff. Who are they hiring? Who's getting opportunities to get good jobs? And we did a bunch of specific things. I'll give you a couple examples here. We focused first on the most vulnerable neighborhood, which was called this Iron Triangle neighborhood here, the most impoverished. We did many things that didn't cost much money, like repainting the street, changing the parking, narrowing streets to slow traffic and make them safer. But we did it with community engagement. We looked at public spaces as spaces of healing and recovery from the trauma of violence. Something that, again, was very significant and remains very, so gardens, reclaiming streets for communities, and doing simple things like this that really changes the aesthetics, the look of a place, and begins to change the dynamic of how people see their place or their neighborhood as can it be healthy or not. Importantly, this was not done by an international consulting firm or construction firm. The work that was proposed to change the community was done by community members themselves. They were paid and employed to do it. They got the economic benefit and the economic skills, the job training skills to do that. This is the transformation of a park that was controlled by drug dealers that's now in a really dynamic community space. Climate change, climate justice is also a major issue in this community. They have a large Chevron Corporation petrochemical refinery, lots of air pollution, truck traffic. And finally, I mentioned violence at the very beginning. Our Health in All Policies strategy created a new city department called the Peacemaking Department, called the Office of Neighborhood Safety. So we've got a transport agency, a planning agency, a parks department, on and on and on. We said, okay, we're going to create a new one that is about peacemaking. So what did that mean? That meant we hired former felons. These were people who came out of prison to be city employees who do street-level outreach to known or suspected gun offenders, people who are known in the community to be shooters, to carry weapons, and to resolve conflicts. There's a lot of gang turf wars in this city. James Houston right here is one of them. Grew up in Richmond, spent 18 years in prison, came out, and now he's what we call a violence interrupter, or a neighborhood change agent. And they go out and they are street-level conflict mediators. But we do something else. We identify those young people, and they're anywhere from 15 to 25, and bring them into the city in a new program called the Peacemaker Fellowship. And just like we try to fund well-educated young people to get a scholarship to go to university, we said, let's fund these young people to get back into, off the streets and out of a life of violence. So we give them a stipend, money, to get their high school education, to get services and maintain their services. A whole host of things. They have mentors. They get to travel outside of the community. We've gone through 4 cohorts, almost 100 of these fellows. 98 of them are still alive, and 96 have not used a gun since they've been engaged. And this is where we are with gun homicides in Richmond. About 6 or so years into this program. We were a couple of years ago, 11 homicides. Remember, we started at almost 50 per 100,000. If you don't reduce violence in neighborhoods and on streets, all the other services of education, of culture, don't matter as much. People are not going to feel safe. They're not going to go outside. They're not going to open their doors. This work is, we do ongoing evaluation. We have a biannual citizen survey. We collect data both on the built environment and on health outcomes. And this is some of the success we've had, and we know there's still a long way to go. And we were happy that the New York Times covered our, give a little plug for our work. Second example, I know I'm running out of time. Again, I said we are in an urban planet, but in 15 or so, 13 years, a quarter of the planet is expected to live in informal settlements or slums. Meaning almost 1 billion people, maybe 1 in 7 on the planet. So again, we can't just focus on cities, we can't just focus on urban health without paying special attention to this increasing kind of epidemic of poverty and inequality. This is some, not even all of our partners in our work in Kenya and in Nairobi, NGOs, local universities, and sometimes local government and even international organizations, to really focus on how do we take these models that I showed you, toxic stress, upstream, this relational approach in an informal settlement to improve health. So we're working across many, at least 3 or 4 informal settlements. Here's one called Mathare, Mukuru. This is Nairobi. You may have heard of a slum called Kibera. It's down here on the lower left, sometimes referred to as the largest slum in Africa.